on a late, calm summer evening of 1995 in a small Edinburgh cafe, a yet unknown writer by the name of Joanne Rowling just finished writing her first ever book, which was to be just a start of her 7-parts project. Second only to the Bible, it was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter stories has arrived. It is the single largest phenomenon in publishing history.
World premiere of the most highly anticipated film this year.
The stars of the film, Rupert Grint, Daniel, and of course Emma Watson.
The first 3 novels in Rowling's series have sold 35 million copies. They have been translated in 35 languages.
Movies down, 10 years. We have watched these characters grow over the last 10 years. This is the end of the phenomenon.
Harry Potter is a massive, well-beloved franchise that's already lasted over 2.5 decades, yet it's still growing stronger, gaining an audience of people of all ages, backgrounds, and ethnicities. Since the release of the last film, in what is now a distant year of 2011, there's been loads of Harry Potter content, coming out every now and then, such as new theatrical plays, video games, and even Fantastic Beasts movies. Through the years, there's been a lot of different reception from the community, some positive, some negative, but whatever the case, no single event has provoked a greater reaction than the recently announced HBO Harry Potter TV series. It genuinely shook the entire fandom, stirring a new wave of debate, speculation, and consequentially, expectation. And as I watch the whole community come as alive as it's ever been in recent years, I think that now, amidst the excruciating wait and just before we enter a whole new chapter, is the perfect timing to actually take a moment, look back, analyze and reflect on the actual story of the boy who lived. So, I've decided to dedicate my next few months to make a complete retrospective of the entire journey. Now, I'm fully aware that there's already loads of videos on YouTube, either talking about the books or reacting to the movies. Some have already discussed how they compare. Some are more generic, while others leap into all sorts of analysis. And I must admit that over the last few months, it's become my guilty pleasure to spend numerous nights watching all of it. Gradually, it opened a whole new dimension that uncovered many nuances and qualities I've never noticed before. It made me go rewatch all of the films and even reread some of the books. And with all of the new knowledge and sentiment I've acquired, I must state that though I'll recapitulate a lot of the already existing points, I'll also point out some stuff I've never heard being talked about. To sum up, I'll present the whole thing in a specific way that I think has genuinely never been presented as before. I know some of you must be eager to start our journey already, and I promise we will. But just before we do, I'd like to take a moment to discuss what will be my main medium to analyze the story. I want to quickly tackle a common argument among fans: the books or the movies. Firstly, I'm going to state that I understand both sides of the argument, because I've read and watched all the installments multiple times respectively, but I am annoyed about a phrase I've been encountering since the dawn of time. If you like the movies better than the books, you are not a true Harry Potter fan, and you don't know what you're talking about. And though I don't prefer one over the other, I feel the need to defend the other side here. I think it's undeniable that the books tell the story in a much more detailed and nuanced way. They include a lot more dialogue and subplots, give characters additional substance, and above all, they are the source material. So naturally, the following thought comes to mind. If a book is used as a source material for a movie, then the movie itself can only do as good a job, if not worse, right? Well, I for one think that such reasoning is like comparing apples to oranges. Movies and books tell a story in different ways and have different limitations. Just as a book can't have moving pictures, a movie can't accurately retell a 700-page narrative within 2.5 hours. That, I think, is clear to all of us. I find that movies, the well-made ones at least, have a special ability to present the story, as they can manipulate the experience through many senses. Now, the most obvious are the actors and the sets and special effects as they visualize the story. But if looked upon closer, movies interact through many more ways. Camera movement, transitions, pacing, color palette, soundtrack. I could go on. If a film is edited in a way where these things are applied thoughtfully, with great care and attention, they majorly play with tone and exhibit all sorts of different themes. They unlock a whole new experience. So in this case, I've chosen the movies to be the main medium to help me retrospect. There's no pretending, Harry Potter movies aren't perfect. Each one has a task to retell a unique chapter of the series. During 10 years of production, there were different directors and screenwriters coming in and departing the franchise, each of them choosing their own approach. Some were opting for a more direct and a general one, while others chose to do it in a more unique and subtle way. And although there were some hits and some misses, some subplots lost, and some characters underdeveloped, for the most part, they've made the job very well done. Some even exceptionally. Within each episode, I'll spend a few minutes solely analyzing the movie itself and talking about its production. But I cannot stress enough that this retrospective is, first and foremost, an analysis of the story, its world, the themes it tackles in each installment, the characters and the actions they choose to take, and what they grow up to be. And because of that, I'll frequently deviate from the movie's plot a bit and include some important events or dialogues from the books that were either left out or not portrayed sufficiently. My goal is to present and analyze the story as best and as interesting as I can. So if that means sometimes veering between the two mediums, so be it. So, without further ado, let's begin where it all started. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is about entering a new phase of life, coming from a world of negligence and misery, and discovering a new promising world, full of intrigue and mystery, and shaping first meaningful relationships along the way. Given that this is the first step into a massive franchise, it had to have done an adequate job at world building and setting up first important plots, whilst keeping the tone fresh and fairy tale-like, considering Harry's 11. A few years after the fiery success of the first novel, a British film producer, David Heyman, was spending his days in a hot pursuit for a children's book that could be adapted into a well-received movie. In 1999, J.K. and David finally met and set the first ideas into motion, and after a while, speculation started to surface about who was the director that was to inherit this major responsibility, one of the names even including Steven Spielberg himself. I'm not going to delve into details, but in essence, it eventually became apparent that Christopher Columbus had the passion and skill to take the role and start the project.
Chris and Stuart created this whole world, and Chris cast these kids and these adults, and he helped set us off on our way.
Action! David Heyman was a wonderful collaborator and very passionate about the film. And I think that's why David and I got along so well. There was nothing else in our minds except making a great film.
It would be an understatement to say this production didn't have a massive challenge laying ahead, as they were the first to visualize the world that so many were already fond of. If this film wanted to succeed and break the ice under the looming expectation, the casting process and set building was to be as critical as ever. Therefore, the producers had a monumental task in choosing between hundreds of young actors, some having close to none or no experience at all. Within a few months, Rupert Grint and Emma Watson landed themselves the roles of Ron and Hermione, but the search for Harry continued in desperation. Finally, at the turn of the century, the whole cast was announced, with Daniel Radcliffe filling the trio in the role of Harry.
The three of them together were just perfect. They really felt like the characters had jumped from the book.
Other important roles were in the hands of Maggie Smith as Professor McGonagall, Alan Rickman as Professor Snape, Robbie Coltrane as Hagrid, and Richard Harris as Professor Dumbledore. It turned out this casting decision was the first masterstroke that paved the success of the series. As we know, Richard Harris sadly passed away just after the filming of the second movie, so his role had to be filled by someone else. When the time comes, I'll analyze the role of Dumbledore and its actor, but for now, I'm going to admit that Harris's portrayal of the headmaster was more than satisfactory and quite fitting for Dumbledore at this early stage.
That is one of my more brilliant ideas. And between you and me, that is saying something.
Another aspect of this production that cannot go unnoticed is Stuart Craig's work on set design, as he set up many locations to be prominent for many years to come. One can really sense the feel of this new magical world, seen through Harry's perspective. The more notable examples are certainly Diagon Alley, Hogwarts Express, Great Hall, and the Gryffindor Common Room. Experiencing these locations through the scenes, accompanied by the true-to-character actors, makes for a very pleasant experience, as the world from the books very believably comes to life in front of us. So in that aspect, I'm more than willing to say that this film greatly establishes a high standard that the future installments were held against. Speaking of later films, in comparison with Philosopher's Stone, it's clear that this film is still primarily aimed at children and young teenagers. That's not to say that this fact undermines the quality or value of the product, as it is more than appropriate for this early stage of a 3,400-page long narrative that's gradually turning maturer and darker. This lighter and warmer tone is more than welcome, as it later effectively establishes the contrast to the desaturated style that's to come. Now, I see no real sense in providing a chronologically systematic summary of the storyline, at least not for this installment, as one. It's probably the most well-known plot of any Harry Potter episode, and two, it mostly stays true to the book, as the script tightly follows and sticks to the original material, and brings little to no notable changes. Obviously, there were some conversations moved around and some events and characters omitted, but mostly I'd be just nitpicking. It is important to state that The Philosopher's Stone and The Chamber of Secrets are possibly the only novels that can be faithfully adapted within 2.5 long runtime, with almost no omissions. In this case, there are some downsides to this approach, as there were hardly any liberties taken, and consequently the film lacks some out-of-the-box visual directing. Scene composition and camera movement are quite simplistic and give a predominant feel of serving exposition, but lack any other artistic approaches. This is fine, given that this is the introduction of the characters and the school, so the observer has a lot to chew on, and given that it is at least for now aimed at a younger audience, it doesn't leave much to be desired. I will, however, touch on our trio's dynamic and observe how their relationship evolves during their first year. Harry first meets Ron at the King's Cross as they make their way onto the train, and it is important to establish this very early on, as it may come up relevant in some later analysis. Ron didn't befriend Harry because of his fame, as initially he didn't even know his name. Now, Harry does introduce himself eventually, so the cover is off quite quickly, and Ron is initially amused about meeting the famous Potter and glancing at his scar. But that dynamic quickly fades off, as it's clear Ron isn't enjoying Harry's company because of his status, but because they genuinely get along. Ron comes from a loving but impoverished wizarding family, and his down-to-earth nature and loyalty, which will manifest in the next years, make him a perfect match for Harry's humble and innocent character. Their initial friendship solidifies when Harry proceeds to defend Ron while confronting Malfoy. Draco is a polar opposite to the redhead, as his initial interest in Harry differs. He wants to make connections, and at this early point, Harry is still speculated to possess some form of dark abilities and a potential for taking charge in resuming the cause of the First Wizarding War. Malfoy quickly learns that this is just purely speculation, as Harry stands up for his friend and later along the way shows no interest in associating with the Malfoys or other similar thinking purebloods. As for Hermione, she initially shows a rather different approach to interacting with these two characters. She is impressed by Harry's company, but she gingerly neglects Ron's presence and appears to be looking down upon him in their first few weeks on the grounds. It is quickly apparent that Ron and Hermione's characters clash a bit, as Ron is a resourceful yet procrastinating type that goes along with it and doesn't mind bending the rules on occasion. Hermione prefers to take a more by-the-book approach, respects the rules, and finds interest and pride in giving an effort in their studies. As some time passes, Harry and Ron have no trouble getting along, as they spend most of the time together. Hermione, however, is still a bit of an outsider, as she is almost a bit too overeager to prove herself academically, and to understand this behavior, we ought to take a moment to dig deeper into Hermione's character of her pre-Hogwarts childhood.
Clearly, fame isn't everything, is it, Mr. Potter?
Clearly, Hermione knows. Seems a pity not to ask her.
Silence. Put your hand down, you silly girl.
Hermione is a Muggle-born wizard, meaning that though she possesses wizarding ability, she is born to normal parents, people who have no idea about the wizarding world or the magic itself. She was raised as a normal Muggle child, just like Harry. So arriving at Hogwarts, she'd be handicapped compared to others, lacking knowledge about magic and how this society functions. She did possess intelligence and eagerness to learn, however, so in fear of being left out and behind, she took it upon herself and spent her entire summer reading and studying whatever material she could get her hands on. Once at Hogwarts, it quickly became apparent she was one of the brightest and most prepared students, not holding herself back and even not restraining to point out others' errors. But unfortunately, this demeanor negatively affected others' perception, and even after a few weeks, she struggled to find any friends. At first, Harry and Ron don't hold back on making observations about her behavior, and one day they speak behind her back, not noticing her near presence.
She's a nightmare, honestly. No wonder she hasn't got any friends. I think she heard you.
Understandably, she storms off, feeling insulted and betrayed by the only colleague she saw potential in being friends with. Once the troll gets released, Harry and Ron decide to go looking after her and find her crying in the bathroom, just as they get attacked by the troll. But after the incident, Hermione surprisingly covers up for the trio, repaying the favor and for the first time showing some clear fondness and respect for the pair. This is the first turning point in their friendship, as Harry and Ron see and appreciate her effort, accepting her into their circle. During the winter, they spend most of the time together, and despite their differences, they prove effective in uncovering the Philosopher's Stone mystery. When they have to face the challenges in the Forbidden Corridor, each of their traits at some point comes to fruition, showing how their different skills and approaches to problem-solving complement each other. Harry possesses a strong sense of justice and a willingness to take risks. He's also clearly talented and makes for a decent leader. Hermione's intelligence and extensive knowledge also greatly contributes in solving puzzles and overcoming obstacles. And Ron, he is the only one of the three who is born and raised a wizard, bringing a fresh perspective and naturally providing a great insight into how things operate in this world, which is still mostly an unknown concept for the first two. The reason why I'm analytically phrasing this stuff is because I want to point out one of the flaws in this adaptation of the novel, a flaw that will prove to keep on repeating itself in the upcoming releases. As they manage to sneak past Fluffy, they face their first real challenge in the encounter with Devil's Snare. In the movie, Hermione is the one who remains calm and collected, coming up with the solution and saving them with her spell, while Ron is just sitting there useless, panicking, and making the situation worse.
Devil snare, devil snare. Whew! Lucky we didn't panic.
Lucky Hermione pays attention in herbology.
In the book, however, Hermione doesn't know how to set the fire in order to repel the plant, and Ron is the calm and collected one who sets her in place and reminds her she's a wizard and tells her to use her wand. It may seem like a minuscule thing, and it was arguably executed this way to give Hermione some spotlight considering her potion scene was cut, but we'll later come to see how this treatment of Ron's character transforms into a recurring issue that will eventually spill into a much bigger problem purely isolated to the movie franchise alone. But for now, I just want you to keep this thing in mind. I'd like to point out one final scene, this time in a more positive note. Just before Harry and Hermione separate, she encourages him and for the first time makes clear why she values his friendship.
You'll be okay, Harry. You're a great wizard. You really are. Me, books and cleverness. There are more important things. Friendship and bravery. And Harry, just be careful.
It may come off as cliché at first glance, but for me, it really speaks volumes about Hermione's character, giving her new levels and nuances, and especially making sense in her latter actions, entering adulthood. She may take interest in her academic well-roundedness and spend an exceeding amount of effort on her studies, but deep down, she truly values a virtuous individual who isn't afraid to take charge and face the challenges, either defending his values or people he cares about, even if that means bending the rules and standing up to the authority. At this early stage of retrospecting, these words may not make great sense in the scheme of these for now underdeveloped characters, but I'll make sure we stumble across this topic again, perhaps a bit later, where such analysis comes fully into fruition. Before I further discuss some more of the positives, let's quickly tackle a few remaining inadequacies. Firstly, I cannot go on ignoring the outdated CGI. It's nothing to scream about, given this is an early 2000 children's fantasy movie, but still, I thought it was worth a mention. Secondly, there is some apparent unpolished acting in this piece of work, mostly due to the lack of experience of the young actors. It's a trade-off director Christopher Columbus had to make if he wanted a cast that closely resembled their characters. And if you ask me, it's a trade I'd take any day of the week. It's really ever noticeable in this case, but should you choose to turn a blind eye, it's completely fine. So again, this one is nothing major to make a fuss about.
That's insulting. It's as if they don't trust us.
All of those downsides, however, are mostly insignificant compared to all the things that were done right. I've touched on several already, so I won't go on repeating myself like a broken record, but for this final part, I'd like to leave you with some last observations. The first one is the score. There's a good reason why John Williams' music is so memorable, as it established itself as an icon at the same soaring heights as the characters themselves.
What's beautiful about what John does is he creates these moments, it might be 6 or 7 notes, that you remember forever. And those first moments of the Harry Potter score, which are still being played in the trailer to this day, it's just, you know exactly where you are, you know exactly what you're listening to. So I feel very privileged to have had that John Williams experience.
It's been a special joy for me, particularly in the musical sense, that I can go perform with symphony orchestras. It seems like anywhere in the world we play material from Harry Potter and people relate to it.
Now, I won't go into much detail about this first volume of the soundtracks, as it's still at the start of a 3-part evolution that will, once we get to The Prisoner of Azkaban, flourish into a glorious masterpiece worth examining. But for this first instance, I'll go as far as to say that though it doesn't reach the artistic complexity and nuance of some later establishments, it perfectly complements the tone the movie was going for, the cheerful intrigue and fascination, and other times a more sinister approach when the scene calls for it. I've already mentioned that soundtrack is one of the key components in cinematography, and we can definitely appreciate this aspect of the franchise from the very beginning. My second topic is the striking feel of Hogwarts. While reading the books, I've always imagined a glorious castle, its vast grounds stretching over a breathtaking Scottish Highland scenery while still retaining its cozy and warm feeling, and movie Hogwarts certainly lives up to that. Some of you may not know, but Hogwarts is supposed to be a character in itself, having its own mysterious wit and a dynamic feel. And granted, this film's version of the castle is lacking in some aspects. Most of the shots we get are static and simplistic, with people coming in or leaving a certain classroom or a hallway. We don't really get a dynamic experience of how the corridors connect, nor a clear depiction of how the outside vegetation interacts with school's grounds. We'll delve into that in the Prisoner of Azkaban film regarding how that movie outdid itself on the matter, but nevertheless, Philosopher's Stone's creation is more than satisfactory groundwork for the following parts. Finally, I've saved the most important one for the end, and as I feel it's such an important topic to discuss, I've dedicated it its own chapter. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone masterfully highlights 2 of the most important early aspects of the plot. The first one is Harry's innocence. Having been negligently raised by his aunt who resented his mother, he developed a glaring sense of modesty and humility. He might have learned he's famous and desirable, but that doesn't get to his head. He's never boastful, never expecting, and most of the time conservative and respectful the way he approaches new people. But when the situation calls for it, he isn't afraid to show his loyalty to people he knows deeply care for him. And when he feels sorrow, he likes to back off and spend his time in solitude, either being reminiscent of his parents or simply seeking inspiration or motivation to continue his quest and not give in. This state of mind is obviously not limited to the first installment alone, so it may definitely reoccur later. And finally, let's talk about the one who shall not be named and the tragic passing of Harry's parents. Their subplot is established quite sufficiently, not too convoluted, yet dealt with enough care to leave a significant undertone amidst all the jubilant scenes. It contributes to a perfect narrative that shows some substance under the surface, whilst remaining simple and digestible for its intended audience. Voldemort's aura is also portrayed quite sufficiently, giving him an intimidating presence and painting an unsettling atmosphere even when he's not actively present on the screen. It's still very early on, and even at the end of this first part, the majority of Harry's parents and their friends, the tragic fate and sacrifice they made, is still quite vague and mostly not uncovered, as is appropriate for the first establishment of a very long narrative. Any further revelations in this plot would feel out of place and rushed, given the character's young age and the tone of the Philosopher's Stone, which is admittedly a children's book, a notion which is certainly conveyed onto the big screens. Therefore, the subtle and quiet way this movie tackles James and Lily's backstory is certainly well appropriate, and it also opens one of the most important themes to come. Harry Potter is not all about magic and adventure. Far from it. This will come to be a very personal story, where characters deal with loss and suffering whilst trying to find their role and identity in this mysterious and challenging world. This scene represents Harry saying goodbye to his parents, finally coming to terms with the fact that he won't seek them again, because among his new friends, he's found his new family. When he lets go of Hedwig, he is leaving the death of his loved ones behind and moving on to a new present. Hogwarts is now Harry's new home, and he has truly found solace within it. What Philosopher's Stone doesn't quite achieve in terms of vision and cinematographic excellence, it makes up with spirit and heart. Emotional ties between characters are presented effectively and genuinely, and Harry's good-natured innocence is a lovely encapsulation of what this series started out as, full of wonder and charm, with just a little hint at some underlying darkness. There's not much to say about the Chamber of Secrets. I know some of you might be taken aback by this rough introduction, but given that I won't be spending much time analyzing this installment, with my reasoning behind the decision hopefully making sense in a few minutes, I thought of a clever, simple way to set up the introduction to this brief chapter, using that slightly argumentative take. Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets serves in many ways as a textbook sequel to the first establishment. The second entry of this series was one intending to build on the foundation of the Philosopher's Stone, while also introducing some slightly darker concepts. It's spending its time primarily world-building, raising the stakes and mostly relying on previously established character dynamics and charm, which I believe is a predictable and fair way to go, but in this specific case, coming with an almost negligible unfortunate consequence of slightly stalling with the current character development. But in light of the vast amount of plot coming our way in the next few years, this little grudge fortunately exists just as a passable nitpick. Talking about world building, the first major introduction on our way is the Burrow and the Weasleys. We've already gotten a solid glimpse at this family in the first installment, mostly through virtues and behavior coming from Ron's character, but now, for the first time, we get a genuine insight into the Weasley family, how they communicate, how they get along, and generally how a big wizarding family, virtually on the edge of poverty, functions. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley are humble, hard-working people filled with heartwarming hospitality and a will to keep this family intact as one loving, coherent little group of people, despite their not-so-favorable conditions and the variety of ages of their children. Harry, and later down the way Hermione, quickly learn to respect and secretly adore these great parenting efforts, as well as the general cheerful and optimistic vibe at the table.
It's not much, but it's home. It's brilliant.
And who are you?
Oh, sorry, sir. I'm Harry, sir. Harry Potter.
Your sons flew that enchanted car of yours to Surrey and back last night.
Did you really? How'd it go? Did you ever? I mean, that was very wrong indeed, boys. Very wrong of you.
But with the Weasley family out of the way, I'm eager to turn our attention to the main new concepts we are introduced to, with plot points such as the bits of aristocratic racism, the looming threat of petrification and death, Parseltongue, and the chamber itself. The direction is clear. If Philosopher's Stone's main theme was to tell about the wonders of discovery, Chamber's intent was to display the flip side of that, to display how chilling the secrets looming in the darkness can be. The goal here was to maintain the style that was brought about from the Philosopher's Stone, but at the same time taking the series in a slightly darker trajectory, one not so fairy tale-like as before. When Harry first got to this wizarding world, it seemed to be the perfect place full of wonders, the perfect place to escape to from the Muggle world. But coming to Hogwarts the second time round, we're beginning to uncover some darker patches lurking out of the still mostly undiscovered society. I'm not talking about the Chamber of Secrets, nor the Basilisk, as these two mainly serve for this book's internal plot purposes alone and later don't really matter all that much. Rather, I'm talking about the pure-blood obsession that's been forming among some wizarding families for quite some decades. This problem is much more scalable, as it is once more slowly creeping in to cause a new war and dystopia. This systematic oppression based on bloodlines and heritage can be seen as a thrilling analogy to all the great horrors committed by humanity, or in this instance, the Muggle world. The most glaring parallel being anti-Semitism spread by the Nazis and the Holocaust itself. We are beginning to understand that these two worlds might not be too dissimilar at all, as both can be fundamentally flawed and infected with these dangerous ideologies. Let me back all this thought with a particular sequence of scenes in the film. Until this moment, we've already been introduced to Lucius Malfoy and his remarks at the bookstore, but now it's the first time we get to see this on Hogwarts grounds, amongst the children. So far, I've talked about this topic on an objective and systemic level, as it's specifically affecting one of our main beloved characters, Hermione.
No one asked your opinion, you filthy little mudblood.
Given that it's name-calling within a group of students, it may not seem that important in the context, but in the grand scheme of the things to come, it opens a perspective into how Hermione's heritage might affect her life in the coming years, reaching some serious implications in case the war engulfs the Wizarding Society once again.
It means dirty blood. Mudblood's a really foul name for someone who's Muggle-born, someone with non-magic parents, someone like me.
After the incident, the trio runs to visit Hagrid, and this time around, we are presented with a much more heartwarming scene. With Hermione in tears, Hagrid comforts her and gives her courage. He is the first adult that so warmly affirms her efforts and character as a whole.
Come here. Don't you think on it, Hermione. Don't you think on it for 1 minute.
This conversation marks a start of a close relationship between Hermione and Hagrid, and we'll find along the way that Hermione deeply cares for him, perhaps the most she cares for any teacher. Unfortunately, we don't get to see that develop in the upcoming movies, but it is a thing in the books. Ron also receives quite a lot of attention this time around, and Rupert's acting, as well as others, is noticeably improved. Mostly, he gets a lot of comedy, and his facial expressions deliver some refreshing scenes amidst all the action.
Can we panic now?
All that is great, but the thing is, they are just that, occasional gigs. In contrary, Harry and Hermione get a vast set of their own challenges, with Hermione trying to sniff out the details about the chamber and its history, later becoming a victim of basilisk attacks herself, and Harry discovering his new ability of speaking Parseltongue and wondering about all the consequent implications. He is not only meeting occasional contempt from others, but also worrying about what this ability shows about who he is. And getting back to Ron, I get that he's supposed to be the one who brings the occasional comedic relief, but given that he is a part of the main trio, I don't get why screenwriters cut the little role besides comedy he gets in the novel. I'm referring to the previous scene at Hagrid's, this time in a different light. As much as it is empowering and emotionally satisfying to see Hermione getting comforted, I don't get why she is the one explaining what, or rather who, a mudblood is, and what it means to be called as one. I understand that she is the one most affected by the previous incident, making her the most relevant character in the scene, but just because the script wants us to feel sympathetic towards the character doesn't give Hermione the right to be the one explaining the answer to the other two. You might have noticed this is a very similar complaint as the previous one I made for the Philosopher's Stone. Hermione is a very bright, skilled, and hard-working individual with a vast amount of knowledge, but that knowledge is mostly limited to the content of the textbooks, with a very constrained insight into what living in such a society looks like in practice. Ron is the perfect candidate to turn to for this kind of a situation, something the book briskly recognizes and gives him the temporary spotlight. Why did the film's script choose to detour this little opportunity to give Ron some other role than simply comedy? I have no idea. Furthermore, it doesn't make sense when taking into account how accurately the script follows the book's footsteps. This movie follows its book counterpart potentially even more tightly than its predecessor, and unfortunately this shows in certain aspects of the film. Chamber of Secrets feels a bit bloated, a little too long for its own good. It's baffling to see that in spite of this being the second shortest book in the series, with most of the plot still not uncovered, it possesses the longest runtime of them all, reaching 2 hours and 41 minutes. I haven't got anything against long and complex films, but Chamber of Secrets simply isn't the right candidate among all others in this series. The film's interpretation is more or less following the novel to a T, but that is part of the problem, and that's why creative liberty is sometimes necessary when adapting source material. You may have needed to play the Quidditch match to make sure that Harry broke his arm, to make Lockhart turn his arm into jello, to ensure he'd end up in the hospital, to hear more exposition from Dobby and find out that the chamber had been opened. But it's not illegal to change that sequence of events to better serve the pacing of the story. In isolation, these sequences don't seem bad or drawn out, but add up so many sections that are a bit too directly taken from the books, and it makes the film seem like a bit of a chore. Certain scenes go on for longer than they need to, others should have been shifted around or omitted for a better flow. Some story structures just work well in one medium and not in another, and in my opinion we see that with the adaptation of Chamber of Secrets. However, structural and directorial issues aside, this is not a bad movie, as there's a lot left to be admired. Besides the improved acting, it has to be commended that for a lot of the major scenes, the film opted not to use CGI to carry an air of authenticity. The basilisk is partially a large puppet of sorts, Aragog is an animatronic machine, and the same goes for the Whomping Willow as well. So much respect has to go out for the work taken to make these elements feel and look real and organic. Additional characters we are introduced to are portrayed faithfully, with two very talented and fitting actors for their respective roles, Jason Isaacs as Lucius Malfoy and Kenneth Branagh as Gilderoy Lockhart. The soundtrack in general maintains the same magical feel, but underscores a bit more darkness as a natural progression. The Burrow is incredibly well realized as a great piece of set design and imagination. The bonds between the characters are further strengthened, the lore and world building open up decently as well. And while all of that is just a byproduct of such a faithful script adaptation, it is presented very authentically and naturally. Hogwarts life has progressed a tad from being wondrous, new, and exciting to a life that is a bit more mundane, which also helps to contribute to this slightly darker trajectory. They really nailed the creepy tone that gradually heightens as people are continuously attacked, and it all hits a peak with a quite good climax, some revelatory information on Voldemort, and Harry bringing Ginny back to safety. Chamber of Secrets definitely isn't helped by having to adapt what I would consider the weakest book in the series, but it all comes together in the end to form an okay film that, while a bit disappointing for me personally, does its job in telling an important part of the story and evolves the complexion of the series to something just a little more sinister and richer. However, 2 entries down and more than 5 hours into the series, nothing had quite captured the living, breathing, flowing world that the series takes place in. I very much admire and appreciate Chris Columbus's first 2 films for laying the foundation through some brilliant casting and set design, establishing the magical tone, but in terms of taking advantage of the medium, Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets stumble pretty badly. It's often been postulated by critics that the first 2 films feel a bit like a stage play, and that sentiment is due in a large part to the uninspiring visual direction. The composition and directing is a bit too stiff for such a vivid series, and the castle is far too lifeless. They played it safe, not thinking outside the box like playing with camera and tone on a larger scale. There's almost no instances in these 2 films that couldn't be transcribed back into text, like the one taken from the novels, therefore not presenting a few fresh components that previously couldn't be communicated through the medium of a book. Nothing had really nailed Harry Potter as a film series, with a serious, well-executed vision, apart from simply telling a story from a novel, not using the motion picture medium to its full advantage. Nothing yet. Note that from this point on, my analysis will get quite a bit longer and more elaborate. As I've now stated many times, the first 2 films are extremely loyal and not very abstract in terms of production, but I have much more to discuss with the next 6 films of the series, in terms of theming, direction, stylistic elements, strengths, weaknesses, and more. With the refreshing first change of leadership, director Alfonso Cuarón is going to be the one to take us on, journeying into an interesting new chapter of Harry's life.
You know, the very first time I saw you, Harry, I recognized you immediately. Not by your scar, by your eyes. They're your mother, Lily's. Your mother was there for me at a time when no one else was. Not only was she a singularly gifted witch, she was also an uncommonly kind woman. She had a way of seeing the beauty in others, even and perhaps most especially when that person could not see it in themselves. You're more like them than you know, Harry. In time, you'll come to see just how much.
Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban is the book where things finally start to get intricate. The first two novels were more or less straightforward, focusing on building foundations. But now that Harry is slowly leaving his childhood and starting to get used to this world, no longer wondrously exploring it, we're entitled to expect a more complicated subject matter this time around. And indeed, this entry is the first to break the ice and start to explore ways of telling a story beyond just getting through some basic exposition, and for the first time, building on the narrative through twists, more complexion, and character growth. Prisoner of Azkaban is a bold and independent entry. Harry's time of discovering this world is past, and now he needs to find his place within it, battle his insecurities, and reflect on the past. With the arrival of the third installment, taking the franchise in a fresh direction, change was in the air, bringing new staff members into the fold while bidding farewell to others. After the sad departure of Richard Harris, Michael Gambon took the role of Dumbledore and provided a slightly different take on the character. If Harris's portrayal was soft and graceful, Gambon approaches his role in a more direct and authoritative way. He still retains some warmth, but when the situation calls for it, his delivery of lines is more cutting, more energetic. This presents a contrast to Harris's static work, and it's hard to tell which approach is more appropriate.
Welcome, welcome to another year at Hogwarts. Now, I'd like to say a few words before we all become too befuddled by our excellent feast.
But considering what Dumbledore's actor would have to execute in some late appearances, it's hard to dismiss the fact that Gambon is a better equipped actor that could match the physical demands of shooting those scenes. Another noteworthy change was the one of leadership. It's clear that Christopher Columbus poured his heart and soul into the first two projects, but that apparently took its toll, as at the end of Chamber, he reportedly felt overworked and wanted to return to his family. The producers had to quickly find the right director to not only take the ship on, but also explore and refurbish the next entry, capitalizing on the upcoming slight but evident shift in tone and progression of the narrative. Choosing Alfonso Cuarón was a bold and unpredictable move, as his previous work couldn't be associated with what the first two films set the direction as. But maybe this was a much-needed gamble to shuffle the cards and evolve Harry Potter's recognition from just a kid's fantasy series to something more unique and something that relates and is appreciated by a broader audience.
When I was deciding if to take it or not. A good friend of mine is Guillermo del Toro. He really wanted me to do this. Yeah. Says, you have to do this, but don't try to do your thing. Just try to serve the material. And if you serve the material, you may do your most personal film. But then I read the book. And I fell in love with it. I saw the potential for that movie. What did you fall in love with? In a way, I was coming out of this movie, Tu Mamá También, that is the journey of two teenagers seeking for their identity as adults. And here's the journey of a kid seeking for his identity as a teenager. So I felt that I was in a very comfortable place.
If Philosopher's Stone and Chamber of Secrets were winter movies, where one watches them close to midnight, cuddled in blankets while outside snowflakes gently flow in the soft glow of night, Prisoner of Azkaban is a film with a scent of a summer cooling down into a contemplating autumn, where the most poetic and quiet scenes reflect on Harry's past, turning the attention to a cold, scary future ahead of him. Chamber brought a darker progression from the first entry, yes, but Azkaban is a first true step of growth in the series. It is visually dimmer than its predecessors, a lot of it taking place at nighttime or amidst a storm. The color palette is a shade more gloomy and slightly less saturated, with some enhanced shadows, contributing to a more foreboding experience. The sheer concept of the Dementors, ugly, terrifying creatures that feed on happiness, is the darkest thing the series has introduced us up until this point. Another noteworthy example are the constant appearances of crows, symbols of foreshadowing the impending darkness and death. We might not know it yet, but change of the general narrative in this series is lurking just behind the corner, now just a year away. You might remember the little grudges I had with the basic and static Hogwarts that was portrayed in the first entries, which served a satisfactory job in helping to set up the universe, but fundamentally needed a drastic refurbishment if it wanted to keep in touch with the ever-changing tone and brewing complexion of the upcoming entries. With Prisoner of Azkaban on the horizon, Cuarón needed to have a meticulous understanding of the layout of this place if he intended to use this layout to its fullest, to break the previous simplistic concept in order to support Azkaban's narrative, which is a witty, dynamic, and an introspective tale. He essentially started from scratch, completely reimagining and redesigning the castle to give viewers a great understanding of Hogwarts and its dynamics. Obviously, we don't explore every inch of every corner, but that's besides the point, and would leave too much work to do in one movie. What we do get is a substantial insight into not only specific places, but more importantly, how these places connect, and how the corridors lead one into another. For the first time, we genuinely understand how students migrate from the Great Hall to the small staircase that leads to the much bigger Grand Staircase and end up in the common room. But even more notable is the path of how one travels from the castle's grounds, departing under the clock tower, walking through the courtyard, across the bridge, overseeing a breathtaking Scottish scenery, down the hill following a twisted path, meandering by the spruce trees and standing stones, ending at a redesigned Hagrid's hat and its garden with forbidden forest and the great lake lurking just behind it. Not only can we visualize students' everyday commute more authentically, Hogwarts is also more full of life than ever before. Dynamic shots definitely contribute to this feel, but it's not the only thing making an impact. For example, the paintings that have previously been sugar-coated graceful statues now actually behave like humans, being loud, grumpy, and sometimes obnoxious. In another example, the Whomping Willow now also possesses a temperamental personality of its own, and because Alfonso not only wanted the castle to look more alive, but also more connected to nature, the ever-recurring shots of the Willow are the most notable example, used to effectively convey the changing of seasons and the passage of time. It's a motif that not only adds visual interest to the film, but also emphasizes the theme of the ever-evolving nature of the story and the character's journey. It's also the first time we get to visit Hogsmeade, and again, I've got nothing but praise. Not that the village plays an essential role or anything, but it's nice to see how scenes capture the enchanting and whimsical nature of the wizarding world, but in a completely realistic way. Like the majority of the film's settings, it's not delivered in standalone exposition shots, but simply serves as a setting for interactions, or in some way moving the plot forward. In general, whenever we get to a new location, we don't stop the flow of the narrative to solely show exposition. Rather, it all comes off natural, either being fused as a part of the general mundane or some important dialogue. Combining everything that's been said, Hogwarts is finally what it should be, a cohesive, vibrant, and immersive platform instead of a bunch of sets. Try to imagine all the upcoming movies, but with the castle of the first 2 entries, and you'll quickly understand just how important it was they stopped improvising and actually put together a fully realized castle. It's equally important to notice that filmmakers not only addressed the shift in immersion, but also took significant steps in how Hogwarts is depicted. In essence, if the first 2 films give a feeling they're set in a fantasy, fairy tale-like environment, Azkaban is set in an intriguing but raw world. It helps you remember that this isn't just some next big adventure, but more like a new year in these people's lives, bringing new demanding challenges. It's very real. It's true that these surroundings boast fantasy attributes, but their portrayal is grounded in reality, trying not to exhibit some unreachable aura, but intending to lay out just how integrated these settings are with students' everyday life. It's shown as just another place in this universe one could simply visit and stroll through, potentially experiencing every bit of emotion he could back home. In times of predicament, it might be some form of anxiety, other times just lighthearted banter with his mates.
Broaden your minds. Use your inner eye to see the future.
Alfonso's approach to Azkaban is to treat it as a story about family, relationships, and love that happens to be set in a magical world, instead of one driven by the magical elements. There are multiple factors that contribute to Harry's situation throughout this story. At the Dursleys, who've always been a constant source of distress and isolation, he blows up Aunt Marge over some derogatory comments about his parents. While this action may feel satisfying to the observer, it also showcases the mounting anger and frustration Harry has been harboring for years. The revelation that Sirius Black has escaped from Azkaban poses a grave threat to Harry's life. Not only is the man that's after him a convicted murderer, but also the one who is believed to have betrayed Lily and James to Voldemort, which forces Harry to confront the loss of his parents all over again. The final nail in the coffin is his chilling introduction to the Dementors, who not only present an intimidating presence, but also affect him more than others, as he relives the night of his parents' murder and feels overwhelmed by despair and helplessness. All of the above results in a subconscious desperation to regain control over the pace at which his life has started to change. But more often than not, this leads to a constant longing of trying to find solace in learning more about his parents to gain a deeper connection with them. Hence, the 2 main focuses of this installment are on the idea of growing up and loneliness. Alfonso Cuarón is a master in visual storytelling. He uses shots that create compositions which communicate Harry's isolation, either in the first scene where he must work on his magic in secret, or in later moments of loneliness in the courtyard, while his friends are on the trip to Hogsmeade. These compositions may not always be apparent and require a scrutinizing watch that fishes out this detail, but once apparent, it's jarring to get a sense of just how often the director uses this tactic, seamlessly integrated within a scene. The film is stunning, moving from one iconic shot to another, but we're never lingering on something for too long, having a constant sense of motion. Plenty of shots use dynamic camera work, giving the story a sense of momentum, at times forced momentum. Time is moving a tad too fast for Harry to handle. He's not ready to take the step and grow up. The best example of a dynamic scene that's putting Harry in a distressful position is this very long take in the tavern, where the Weasleys are set at a table together with Hermione, greeting, laughing, and talking, while Mr. Weasley sets Harry aside and walks him, meandering between the pillars and warning him about Sirius Black. And after more than a minute, the shot ends with a zooming view on Harry, framing him pressed against the wall, alone. And if there's one scene that combines all the mentioned motives, it's the one with Harry in the clock tower again in solitude, looking out of the window with a giant hour hand ticking right in front of his face. All that considered, that's why the warm scenes with Lupin or his friends, even those slice-of-life moments of young teenagers simply being themselves and having fun, are so important. They remind Harry that he doesn't have to be alone. Prisoner of Azkaban introduces two very important characters in the series. Both men look weathered, scarred from the events of the past, and both have a personal emotional connection to Harry's parents. The role of Sirius has been handed to Gary Oldman, who is able to embody a terrifying presence for the false villain facade in the first two acts. But when his true identity is revealed, he's able to show an indescribable sense of soul and spirituality. David Thewlis takes on the role of Lupin and excels at showing compassion and kindness, with an undertone of some indescribable sadness, carrying an aura of melancholy. Despite Sirius being one of the most impactful characters in Azkaban's plot, in terms of a father figure, he's not really as influential to Harry as he'd later become. For the vast majority of this plot, he's serving as a false threat, a catalyst that disturbed Harry's year and sent him onto a path of solitude and finding himself. But in terms of actually being present and mentoring Harry through obstacles, he can't be there for Harry as his twist comes at the end. So up until that moment, Remus Lupin is the person who gives Harry some consultation, guidance, and equally important, some new information and insight into Lily and James's childhood and their friendship. This is a new territory for Harry, as previously he had been only privy to some plain secondhand information about his parents, but now, not only does he get a lot more insight, he gets to meet and talk to people who were deeply connected to them. This opens a whole new window to the past, and a chance to watch Lupin and later Black reminisce about people who they deeply care for. Through his talks with Lupin, Harry is able to understand who his parents were, which helps him put to rest some of his uncertainties and allows him to feel a sense of identity and comfort through establishing a new, more meaningful bond with them. Understanding that his mentor knew them intimately eases his mind in what is his most difficult year at Hogwarts yet. Furthermore, they both share a similarity in being some form of social outcasts. Harry often feels like an outsider due to his fame as the boy who lived, and all the affairs that come with it. He struggles with the burden of expectations, and often finds it hard to connect with his peers as they sometimes treat him differently. Remus is a werewolf, and as a result, he's experiencing isolation and loneliness due to the stigma and discrimination associated with his condition. Even though he is an excellent teacher and a kind person, his condition keeps him at arm's length from others. However, just as we see how Lupin influences Harry, I think it's equally important to notice how this relationship works both ways. Harry gets to lean on his new mentor and form a connection to what has been lost, but it's easy to forget that Remus lost just as much in the same ordeal. He experienced the loss of his two best friends, with the other two vanishing from the face of the planet. And although 13 years have passed, time sometimes isn't enough to heal the wounds. So meeting Harry, seeing him in flesh and mentoring him through the year, in turn helps Lupin turn a new page in his otherwise painful story he shares with the Potters. Upon reflection, Lupin came into Harry's life at the perfect time to act as the exact kind of support that was needed. Ultimately, this is a bond shared between two people isolated from the world who find it difficult to move on from the past sorrows. The first two scores of the series primarily aim to encapsulate the fantastical elements, which were predominantly characterized by late Romantic orchestral music. However, this musical approach wouldn't work when paired with Cuarón's approach for Prisoner of Azkaban. John Williams adapted his musical style for the third film and opted to simplify his motifs and introduce a diverse array of musical styles to align with the film's aim to create a more realistic and dynamic world. While Romantic orchestral music remained a significant component, it was complemented by experimental jazz for the frenetic night bus sequence, a medieval ensemble to accompany scenes within and around Hogwarts, and avant-garde orchestral music to convey the eerie presence of the Dementors and the Boggart, and choral music to represent the powerful Patronus charm. The shift to longer and more developed scenes required Williams to create musical themes that could be extended to match the emotional and physical aspects of the visuals, and accordingly, the music was designed to serve the action, not merely accompany it. This is perfectly demonstrated in the Buckbeak's flight, which is one of my favorite scenes in the franchise, and here's why. The score is obviously the main contributor, as harmonic and rhythmical shifts are all carefully designed to reflect the visual cues throughout. It begins with thunderous thumping to match the beating of Buckbeaks. Then comes an ascending string line as they take off, followed by rising horn and woodwind lines. We hear strings gliding above the rhythmical patterns in the woodwind and brass, and we feel almost weightless. Then, all of a sudden, Buckbeak turns and descends towards the lake as the score picks up its pace and raises the tension, preparing us for the ultimate backdrop. The music gives the feeling of joyous, restless energy. When Harry stretches out his arms, we truly feel and understand that this is the first time he has felt free, experiencing complete elation without any shadows of burdens. Instead of just looking at the action, the score allows you to feel it and lets you experience what Harry is experiencing. It perfectly captures his yearning for freedom and his sheer want to reach beyond his station and find his own internal peace. The theme we hear now is perhaps the most important musical idea of the whole entry. This is a window to the past, although I think of it more as a theme of love and of longing for a family. If Azkaban is ultimately a journey of embracing the reality of change and reminiscing about people who we feel deeply connected to, this melodic theme therefore has to develop with the shift Harry's under as he gradually learns the truth. John Williams does this in a very intelligent way. Initially, the Celeste, known for its use in Hedwig's theme, introduces this motif in Harry's room, and we also immediately get the theme's visual representation. However, its second appearance features a recorder, accompanied by the harp, strings, and a nova. This rendition adds a plaintive, nostalgic quality, but lacks some warmth present in the first iteration. The second time Harry talks to Lupin, the clarinet and flute seamlessly transition to a soft horn rendition, which represents that Harry is slowly getting comforted as the talks with Lupin go by. Eventually, this motif further develops and changes when for the first time, Harry gets to battle a boggart in the form of a Dementor. The Patronus charm necessitates a memory of intense happiness, and when Harry uses the memory of his parents, we hear a triumphant version of the motif. We get a sense of how Harry feels as ecstatic horns play atop a rich choral texture.
Expecto Patronum!
And finally, this triumphant version of the motif resurfaces when Harry fights off a sea of Dementors to save his past self and Sirius. His journey of developing the ability to cast a Patronus is now complete, and as a result, he is now greatly developed as a wizard, and due to the nature of the conjuring, as a person. He finally proves to himself that he can tap into his longing for love and connection to gain strength. There is one final rendition of the motif, perhaps the most touching and significant of them all. But before we get to that, let's talk about the climax. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban is the first book that is a bit too long for the direct adaptation. In the case of the climax, the scene in the shrinking shack is greatly expanded in the book, containing long exposition dumps about that fateful night and providing significant depth into our understanding of the Marauders and their history with Snape. But these long dialogues wouldn't translate well onto screen, so in turn, Cuarón and screenwriter Kloves trimmed these scenes down to better fit them into an already long climax, which takes up a whole third of the film. Having said that, what we do get is perhaps trimmed out too excessively, to a point where we lose quite a bit of nuance. It's one thing if the film omits the book's canon to better serve the pacing and its own narrative, but here it's the case of not even making sense within its own plot. For instance, we never get to understand why Snape despises Lupin, even though we have previously clearly established his animosity towards him. Another problem here is one that is hardly a flaw, but rather the first domino in the script that would lead to some pretty big writing problems later on, and that is the approach taken with Ron and Hermione. You may have noticed I've already been quite adamant about this topic before, and that is for a reason we'll encounter at the endmost entries. Now, considering all the praise I've given filmmakers for this movie, you might think this continuous problem ceases here, but unfortunately, one of the few detriments of this film is precisely regarding this topic. Hermione is extremely authoritative and powerful throughout the whole plot, while Ron comes off as more submissive, indecisive, and sometimes just plain fool.
That is the second time you have spoken out of turn, Miss Granger. Are you incapable of restraining yourself, or do you take pride in being an insufferable know-it-all?
He's got a point, you know.
And then there was also this choice to change this heroic line of Ron's and instead give it to Hermione.
If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too.
We are starting to get a false sense that Ron is mostly present just to be a part of the ride, but all in all doesn't contribute much, serving just as a side gig. And though this isn't completely untrue in the books, he shares a considerably more equal playing field with her. In the novel, they both fight throughout the whole lot, but we feel Hermione is just as responsible for all the arguing. It takes two to tango, and she's presented equally flawed. As for the film adaptation, Steve Kloves oftenly chooses to write Hermione as a counterpart to Harry, portraying her as a female role model. And though we can also attribute this to her character in the novels, Kloves creates this imbalance between these two characters, and as a consequence, it's hard to take Ron seriously and consider him as someone on equal grounds. All of the above applies not only to Azkaban but to the rest of the series as well, so keep this in the back of your mind. However, the most important aspect among the shrieking shack scenes that was, thank God, translated to screen successfully is perhaps the most important thing Harry learns, and that is to learn the value of preserving someone's soul. In Chamber of Secrets, Dumbledore hired Lockhart to show Harry how someone who has all the things most people desire can turn out a total buffoon. In Azkaban, it's the complete opposite, because now Harry sees how someone who is considered a vicious outcast can have a true heart. Through talks with him, he also learns that perhaps no one deserves such a penalty as death, and by the end, this materializes when even after he learns the truth, he's actually unwilling to let Sirius murder Peter. It's important to reflect that earlier in the story, Harry was very keen to offer Sirius to the Dementors, and at times even worse, but by the end, he's not willing to let someone whose crimes are even worse get such a fate. And potentially even more essentially, he doesn't want Lupin and Sirius to become murderers. Peter's fate may have finally caught up to his awful betrayal, and Harry naturally wants some justice or retribution, but maintaining Lupin and Sirius's integrity of their souls and their innocence is just as important to him. Saving innocent lives is more important than punishing guilty ones, and coming to understand and fight for this stance is not only limited to this chapter, but is also an integral part of what our characters in this series stand for. The rest of the film's climax is insightful enough and directed beautifully throughout its entirety. The film's version also builds and expands on the aspect of time travel that was vaguely presented in the book, coming up with these little moments that fully immerse us in the concept.
Fudge is coming. We aren't leaving.
Ow! Blimey, what was that?
Furthermore, I am forever grateful filmmakers let this chain of events breathe as they filled in these sequences with some lingering bits of transitions or dialogue. The scene I'm referring to in particular is the one with Harry and Hermione in the forest where they wait for the scene in the shrieking shack to play out. Quaron and Cloves use this waiting time that would otherwise go to nothing and achieve the feel of passing time through a transition in the woods that further establishes the setting where important events have already taken place and will take place again. As the transition comes to an end and focus switches to the pair, Harry talks about the brief interaction he's had with Sirius after his true revelation, and he starts to wonder about how his godfather could finally turn his life for the better.
You see Sirius talking to me there?
Mm-hmm.
He's asking me to come and live with him.
That's great.
When we free him, I'll never have to go back to the Dursleys. It'll just be me and him. We can live in the country. Someplace you can see the sky. I think I like that after all those years in Azkaban.
And with their last conversation in the film, we finally hear the ending form of Window to the Past, and this time, it's the longest rendition of the motif. It starts off being played by the recorder, but this is followed directly by a version played by horns. We hear how the progression of the entire motif throughout the film is being mapped here, but importantly, it doesn't end as it did in the beginning, for now it has been expanded and developed, eventually taken over by the full orchestra. The evolution of the idea is now complete, marking Harry's full understanding of the truth and illustrating his triumph in overcoming all his trials. Prisoner of Azkaban is about Harry departing his childhood and uncovering the veil of truth, getting caught up in, for the first time, some truly intricate and personal matter, in turn blossoming into a new maturer, more complete self, a step set on a foundation of the first true senses of a triumphantly won identity. In retrospect, this short period of time might be the happiest and the most fulfilling part of Harry's growing up. At the moment, everything feels near perfect, which gives him some newfound confidence as he's entering exciting teenage years in which he's now got every right to be hopeful given his strength and friendships, mentors, and a promising relationship with his godfather. With him, we're departing the final moments of dawn, gazing towards the horizon, where the bright future promises to rise within our reach, where we can grasp it with the palm of our hand. But with hindsight, we unfortunately know that for various reasons, that won't turn out to be the case. And yet, that's exactly why Azkaban is the perfect ending to what I consider a sub-series made of the first 3 entries that as a group form an introduction to the rest of the franchise, where starting with Goblet of Fire, the centric plot finally gets underway. But it's absolutely essential to understand that Azkaban ends the previous inaugural era on a high that promises so much for the future. Why all this potential never really transpired into a tangible reality, and what set of circumstances and mistakes are to blame for this, is a truly complicated and nuanced matter of the next few entries. As he's now fully crossed the threshold into adolescence, the air is filled with a profound sense of change and excitement. But little does he know that behind the same corner lurk some major upsets. Just behind that horizon awaits the turning point.
He will return tonight. Tonight, he who betrayed his friends, whose heart rots with murder, shall break free. Innocent blood shall be spilt, and servant and master shall be reunited once more.
Steve.